Stop. Okay, don't go any further. Have you watched the Welcome to General Biology, the Intro to the Course, and the How to Succeed in General Biology videos? No idea what I'm talking about? Okay, well, on the Course Sakai page under the Resources tab, you'll see, as you can see on the screen over here, okay, you'll find a folder that says Start Here. In there are 3 videos that you need to watch before watching the lecture content. They contain knowledge essential for doing well in this course. Hopefully you'll actually just be able to click on them in the YouTube video that you're watching right now. I'll make it so you can click those Welcome to General Biology, Introduction to the Course, and How to Succeed. I'm hoping I'll be able to make it so you can just click those and it'll take you straight to it. If I can't figure that out by the time I post this though, I'll be sure to include the links in the video description. So make sure to watch those videos, okay? Super important. Now, assuming that you have in fact watched those videos, let's get to the lecture content at hand. At the beginning of each lecture, I'll post the outline for the topics being covered and the associated outcomes. These will actually be perfectly associated with the BIOS form for each lecture, which I'll try to remember to fill out directly below me down here as we kind of move along. Now, sometimes I may forget to do that, but that doesn't mean that you should forget yourself. It is essential that you have a BIOS form filled out for every lecture, right? It's one of those, things that you need to actually bring with you to workshop. Okay, another quick note before we get into this. Most of this content that we'll be covering is covered from chapter 35.2 in the OpenStax Biology book, but we'll also be pulling some content from the Psychology OpenStax book, specifically chapters, as you can see, 8.1 in the second edition. Now, both of these are free, so it's not really a big deal. You can just go on there, go to the links that we provided you before. And remember, the important thing to consider here is that really the lectures are your ultimate guide to content in general biology. It's what you need to know. So it's what you should be focusing on. The books are really there as supplemental and to kind of give you an idea what we're going to be talking about. Anyway, let's actually get to course content for once. So we're going to be starting the course by talking about the basics of biology. Well, I should say the basics of memory, how memory and learning work, both from a biological standpoint as well as a psychological standpoint. Now, obviously, we're talking about the biology of it because this is a biology course. But why the psychology? Well, the two are actually very closely related and tied directly to how you can learn the content of this course. So let's start with the biology, though. Now, neuronal development is the integral process involved with memory and learning. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. For example, you guys may not even know what neuronal actually means. Now, when I say neuronal, I'm referring to anything about neurons, where neurons are the kind of major signaling cells that, when combined with the kind of supporting cells or structures, sometimes referred to as glial cells, they make up your actual nervous system. This includes everything from your brain to your spinal cord to the nerves in your fingers and toes, and even the ones that relay information to your stomach and your pancreas and your liver or whatever. But let's stick with the neurons that you find in your brain because that's where memory is stored. Which leads us to the title topic of this lecture, memory and learning. If memory is the storage of information via neurons and neuronal connections, learning is the use of that stored information. What we find is that the development of memories requires repeated long-term interactions between these cells that ultimately strengthens the connections and interactions between neurons. Now, we're going to get back to that in just a bit, but keep that in mind. Let's first talk about how the structure of your brain actually comes about. Now, a handy analogy is the process of building a house. For example, genetics provide the basic pattern or blueprint for what your brain will look like. You get these blueprints from your parents and they inform just about everything about you, right? So this is simply the guide for actually building the rest of the structure, though, or rather, how the neuronal development occurs. Gene expression is the actual process of reading that blueprint, determining what kind of structures get created and building the house. In biology, it's using DNA as the instructions for what proteins get made, and in this case, what kind of neurological structures are formed. Now, signal transduction is the actual process of gene expression occurring. In our analogy of constructing a home, it's how you have a general contractor read the blueprints, interpret how they should be built, and then direct the workers to do the actual, hammering and building and drilling and whatnot. You go from the signal or the message encoded in the blueprints, which is then read by the foreman and translated into directions for the workers. This is very similar to how signal transduction occurs in biology, with the DNA being converted into mRNA and then translated by ribosomes into protein structures. Now, there's a good chance that most of what I just said means absolutely nothing to you, and that's okay. The important takeaway is that signal transduction means transforming one kind of message into another. And we're actually going to talk lots about the various types of signal transduction I just mentioned, including how you get protein structures from DNA by going through mRNA and then ribosomes and yada, yada, yada. We'll talk way more about that later on in this course, but the moral of the story is you need to know that as an integral component of how your brain develops. Anyway, okay, so now you've developed from conception all the way through birth. You've been born. Great, you have this basic structure of the brain at this point. Awesome. Of course, brains are not stagnant by any stretch of the imagination. What we know, how we think, and what we are capable can change over time, thankfully. This is due to a process called neuronal plasticity, where the structure of the brain is modified after birth. In other words, the brain is malleable, changeable, or plastic. How this occurs is through changes in the connections between neurons in the brain, changes that are the product of experience. These changes are activity dependent, meaning that the more activity involved in a particular concept or idea or activity, the more change occurs. Now, riding a bike is a great example. It takes a lot of practice to develop the necessary neuronal connections involved in the muscular coordination and balance necessary for riding a bike. The act of practicing over and over and over again, or using those same connections over and over and over again, basically tells the brain, hey, this thing is important. Let's devote energy to retaining it. Quick note here, the connections between neurons are called synapses. Let's talk more about that in just a second. Now this gets to the idea of the use it or lose it. In other words, your brain prioritizes the information that you use often and deprioritizes the information that you don't use. How does it do this? Through regulating the structure associated with synapses. Synapses are the gaps between the nerve cells that functions as kind of the connections between these nerve cells. There's a lot of if there's a lot of activity around a particular neuron or a particular synapse, the brain will reshape so there are more connections and more synapses to trigger those neurons. If there's not much activity, you'll deregulate and lose those connections since it does not, so I should say, since it does require a fair amount of energy to maintain them. Now, quick note here, you see this kind of complicated figure, figure 35.15. You don't need to know the details of exactly how this works. We're going to be talking about way more of this, I believe, actually, in Biology 116. So don't sweat it too much, but just have a general understanding of there's a synapse, or excuse me, there's a neuron, a synapse, and a postneuron, and how those two communicate is across the synapse. What else should we know about this? Synapses are connections, and more synapses between different neurons means more activity, right? That's probably all you really need to know. Don't sweat it. You'll get way more of this stuff later on in 116. Okay. Let's simplify things down, and maybe to help illustrate this a little bit further, let's use this very kind of simple diagram representing a neural network around a single concept. Each of the gray spheres represent different neurons that could connect to this central concept. Now, this is a little abstract and maybe a little out there, like what does this have to do with biology? What does this have to do with you learning biology, more importantly? Let's add some context here, right? Let's use photosynthesis as an example for the kind of central concept, right? You're going to have to learn about photosynthesis in a few lectures from now. Well, anyway, the different types of learning activities could be these other neurons that you could then connect to photosynthesis, okay? So you can have words associated with the concept of photosynthesis. You can have images, like pictures of what's happening with photosynthesis. You could have your hearing of me talk about photosynthesis, right? That's a connection you make to the topic. You could talk about it to your peers. You can describe the process yourself, right? That would be a way to associate information with the concept of photosynthesis. And finally, you can use your hands. You could either draw it out, or you could write it out, or you could, if you're very creative, maybe do an interpretive dance. I'm not that creative. Maybe you are. So let's take a look at some examples of how these things can interact. Well, by reading about photosynthesis in the book, you're connecting the words that you read to the concept of photosynthesis. And this would be kind of like creating a synapse or a connection between these two sets of neurons. Your neurons associated with words and this concept of photosynthesis. Okay? Now, if you want to strengthen that connection or make it easier to remember, well, there are two ways you could go about it. You could do the same activity lots and 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 lots of times, right? So this is called temporal summation and relates to a particular synapse or a group of synapses, triggering rapidly in a relatively short amount of time. So in this case, you're rereading the same book over and over and over and over and over again, right? The same content. And if you do that relatively rapidly, that would be considered a form of temporal summation. Now, you could also do lots of related activities to interact with that neuron at the same time. For example, taking notes, or I should say actively taking notes while watching and listening to lecture. Now, this connects the neurons from hearing me talk about the content to seeing, as well as the words on the screen involved in the topic, as well as some of the images or the diagrams that are on the screen. And then you're also using your hands to write down your notes. So each of these things, each of these activities are all connected to this central concept. But, and here's where it gets interesting, more importantly, you're also relating these different things to each other. For example, you're seeing the words that are associated with the images, right? Or you're drawing those images out yourself, or you're writing those images or those words down, okay? Or you're using your hands to write the words that you're hearing down, for example. Now, when you start connecting all these different things together and relating them to each other, this is what we call spatial summation, or the causing of the neuron to trigger by having a lot of related neurons also trigger. It's very important to keep in mind. So you have temporal summation, or using the same kind of process over and over and over again, or you have spatial summation, where you have many different processes all interconnected and interrelated. Okay? Now, neural plasticity, what we've kind of just been describing here, this ability to create new connections, is the natural phenomena that allows for memory formation. But what is memory? Well, memory is the ability to encode, store, and recall information back to working memory. Now, encoding is when you kind of make those permanent connections. Those permanent connections end up resulting in memories stored in the cerebral cortex, and then re-accessing those memories to utilize that information. You recall that information, or retrieve is another synonym there, and you retrieve that to your working memory to actually utilize that. Which, wait a second here. So now I've mentioned working memory, but what is working memory, okay? What does that mean? Well, there are actually different kinds of memory. There is sensory memory, which is where the information is received by your senses and is briefly stored, very briefly. If these memories are not used at all, they almost immediately go away. Using that information causes it to get shifted from the working memory, causes it to get shifted to the working memory. So using the information that your sensory memory stores very briefly, if you utilize that information, it gets moved to the short-term memory or a working memory. This is where the information you're actively aware of is stored for a short amount of time. Typically, you can only hold between like 5 and 9 items in your short-term memory, which is why doing things like chunking or practicing regularly are important. Chunking means taking things that are similar to each other and kind of grouping them together and making associations between those things. I just remembered I'm doing a bad job filling out my BIOS form. I'll do that real quick for you guys. Hold on. Let's see here. Neural development, neuronal plasticity, and I think now we're on to, types of memory. Look at that. See, my BIOS form down here matches the lecture outline here. Handy, right? Anyway, okay. Right. Blah, 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 blah. Chunking. Yes, good, good, good. All right, chunk, connect things together. Great. Moving on here. Okay, so short-term memory is obviously different from long-term memory. Theoretically, you can actually have permanent and infinite connections in your long-term memory. So while short-term memory is only lasts for a brief amount of time, and you can only hold a few things, long-term memory you can actually hold an infinite number of things, and they theoretically can last an infinite length of time. Think about riding your bike again, right? And it's kind of a whole trope. Remembering how to ride a bike. It's just like riding a bike. Same idea here, right? Anyway, so a great example of this that many of you may not be able to relate to is that I still remember the house phone numbers of many of my childhood friends, right? So I can still type out the phone number that I used to call on the house phone and get a hold of them, no problem. Assuming they still live there and that house number is still active, which granted at this point is probably pretty low, but anyway, do I necessarily remember which numbers those go to? No, not necessarily, but that's not really the point. The point is that that information is still in my brain and I can still recall that after decades. Okay. You can think of memory formation and usage as a sorting process, where information is used and that information is deemed important and then retained. If it is not used, then it is unimportant and discarded. If discarded, then no new synapses or connections between neurons will form. For example, if you perceive a stimulus, such as listening to my voice, but do not do anything with that stimulus, it is immediately discarded or forgotten from your sensory memory storage. However, if you use that information in some way, say writing down notes, then it gets encoded into your short-term memory. If you never look at those notes again, though, well, it will probably be discarded and forgotten as well. But if you revisit those notes, reread, and maybe summarize them into, say, BIOS form, then you might start encoding some of that information into your long-term memory, which means it's permanently stored there. The trick, however, is retrieving that information back into your short-term memory so you can actually use it. So the question is, how can you effectively get information from the short-term memory into the long-term memory and then back again? The answer? Long-term potentiation, or LTP. LTP is the process of encoding information into the long-term memory and retrieving it into the short-term memory repeatedly. Okay? Doing this many times. This will actually result in physical changes to the structure of your brain, which I have to say is probably one of my favorite concepts that we talk about in any of the general biology courses, both 115 and 116. So let's briefly talk about it. You don't need to know the details of this process until Bio 116, but here's the general idea. You have a set of neurons that connect to each other via synapses, like we talked about earlier. Here's one neuron, here's another, and here's a synapse. You have a signal from the top neuron that travels across the synapse via these neural transmitters and then reaches the bottom neuron via these receptor proteins that interact with these neurotransmitters. Now, this process of actually accessing the information is what just happened. So you have the signal transfer down the neuron, travel across the synapse, and then activate the other neuron. That's how you activate that memory or the idea or concept or whatever. Now, when you do this many times and you're trying to access that memory or that neurological pathway many times, you're telling your brain, hey, this thing is important. We should probably, be able to do this better. And so that's how you actually encourage the long-term potentiation process. When signals are sent many times, the receiving neuron, the one on the bottom here, is signaled to actually boost its ability to receive messages. It does so by activating a whole new set of receptors, these AMPA receptors. Now that it has more receptors, it's even easier for it to receive a signal and activate a memory. In short, long-term potentiation results in physiological changes in the structure of your brain and the neurons there, which is really wild. So learning causes physiological changes in your brain, and this is exactly how that works, and that's really cool. That's awesome. Anyway, okay, but how do we accomplish this? How do we make long-term potentiation occur? Well, I mentioned chunking before, right? It's when you make sets of related information and it's likely something you do all the time. For example, if I asked, what are some sodas you could purchase? You could probably rattle off a whole stream of brand names that you have chunked together under the label of soda. Doing the same with biology content is a really great way to actually start retaining that information. There are other ways of facilitating long-term potentiation, though. Studying in segments, or in other words, studying for relatively short periods of time, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then take a break. There's actually a lot of research that shows that the human brain doesn't do a great job at focusing for longer than 15 or 20 minutes. Sometimes even shorter amounts of time, maybe even 10 minutes. So if you find yourself getting very distracted after a 15-minute study, session, don't worry about it. No big deal. Take a break, go for a walk outside, I don't know, do some push-ups or something, I have no idea. But take a hot second, take your mind off the topic, and then come back to it. Doing this every day, actually, or maybe every other day, is also critical, as it restarts that signal and tells your brain, hey, this is still important. I know I spent time on it yesterday, and I'm going to spend time on it again today, because it actually is still important. So let's keep this process going. Now, determining what you actually know versus what you think you know is also very important. In other words, test yourself. A great way to do that is by, say, drawing the organizer from memory. If you can't recall that organizer, that means you don't remember that topic very well, right? And that's okay. Not a big deal. If you don't, just go back, refer to your notes, finish out the organizer, and then put it aside and try again to recall it later. Now, finally, explaining information to other people is one of the best ways to actually learn that content. It forces you to solidify what you know and articulate it out loud in a way that somebody else can also understand. This is great because it both points out what you don't know, and it helps you determine better ways of describing the things that you do know. As you can imagine, I have some personal experience with that last one. Well, all of them in particular, but that last one of explaining material to other people feels particularly relevant right now. Okay, one quick note here. The psychology book, you notice at the bottom, the OpenStack psychology book, chapter 8.4, Ways to Enhance Memory, is a pretty good resource that kind of discusses a lot of this stuff already. And I also talk about it a little bit in my learning resources video that I posted. Talk about how to use like the BIOS form and the P's biology and the SALT activity. Talk a little bit about a lot of this stuff there as well. So those are two good resources to take a look at in case you want to learn more about how to facilitate long-term potentiation. Oh, hey, that reminds me. Gotta keep doing this, right? Let's fill out my BIOS form here. There we go. That was long-term potentiation. Great. Okay. Moving on. Now, memory, or the creation, the process of storing information, is not the same as learning. Learning is using that stored information to reduce the likelihood of some kind of a negative outcome, right? Through changing your behavior, usually. Now, there's a really interesting experiment that was done with blue jays that demonstrates this very nicely. A blue jay was presented a butterfly, a monarch butterfly, for example. I think it's actually what this is here in this picture is a monarch butterfly. It would try to eat this butterfly and then immediately vomit. Okay, so the monarch butterfly actually is somewhat poisonous, and that it eats one of its major food sources. Milkweed is not so much toxic as it would poison you and kill you, but toxic as it would make you sick and taste really terribly. So the blue jay tries to eat a monarch butterfly and gets violently ill, and then proceeds to vomit. Now, the next time a blue jay is presented with a monarch butterfly, it immediately starts gagging because it's created such a strong association with that butterfly. So then it learns to avoid eating that butterfly. You also often encounter a similar process with young adults. that have had similar types of reactions to specific types of alcohol due to, say, overindulgence of that particular type of alcohol at some point. They smell that alcohol later and then they immediately feel ill. In both of these cases, either the blue jay reacting to the butterfly or the college student reacting to the alcohol, they learn to avoid the thing that made them ill. And that generally kind of works better for them in the long run, right? Now, this is roughly how natural selection works. But we're going to talk a lot more about natural selection later on in the course. But this is kind of a good intro to it. Now, learning also makes use of information in kind of practical circumstances. In other words, you can take what you learn and use it to improve your life or achieve some goal. Ravens and crows, like the one shown in this little video here, have demonstrated this ability time and time again. For example, this crow has learned how water displacement works in some completely unrelated situation, and now is applying that information to actually increase the water levels in this little tube by dropping in these weights. And that brings the floating treat up high enough they could reach in and pluck it out. So, that's great and all, but how do you do this? Well, discussing it with people, like I said, is a great way to do it. You can practice the information over and over and over again, fostering that temporal summation. You can also teach it to other people. That's a really great one that I've talked about a couple times. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more explicitly about this in the next lecture, lecture 1.2, linking learning to the course. Now, we're going to be talking about how memory in the course is designed, what learning means, what active learning means, and then how these relate to the tools that we've described in other videos. Before we get to that point, though, I'm going to leave you with an example of an exam question so you can start getting comfortable with them. The ones I have in the lectures here, I'll refer to them as lecture questions so we don't get them confused with any of the other practice questions or whatever that you have. But honestly, they're really the exact same thing. They're content questions structured to be exactly like the ones you'd see on the exam. I'm going to leave this up here, but I'm not actually going to go over the answer yet. I'm going to wait until the beginning of next lecture. So there's some incentive for you to keep watching. I mean, I guess you don't need incentives to watch, I suppose, but that's besides the point. The other thing is that you should really try to do is before you watch the next lecture and you see the answer, try to answer it yourself, okay? Try to justify your answer. Talk about it with friends. Maybe discuss it in the forums. That's a great application for the forums. All right? So I'm going to leave you this. If you have any questions, post some questions in the forums, the discussion forums. That's a great option. You can shoot that's probably the first choice I would go. Talk to your friends. That's also a great option. And if you haven't done so already, I'd really recommend checking out those learning resource videos that I posted, way at the beginning of this course. And yeah, I think it's going to be very relevant to the next lecture, where we're going to talk about linking learning to the course. Great. See you next time.